Every evening you perform what I have come to understand as the most profound psychological experiment imaginable. You lie down, close your eyes, and willingly surrender the very thing you've spent your entire waking life defending, your conscious ego. And here's what disturbed me throughout my years of research. You have absolutely no control over where your consciousness travels during those hours. When you cross that threshold into sleep, you descend into territories so vast, so incomprehensibly ancient, that if you truly grasped what awaits you there, you would never take your waking identity quite so seriously again. I have spent decades exploring the deepest mysteries of the human psyche. What I discovered about sleep, about dreams, about the nocturnal journey of consciousness has shaken everything I thought I understood about human nature. And I must tell you, most of you are sleepwalking through the most important journey you'll ever take. Now, let me begin with something that troubled me for years. Every night, your ego, that precious sense of I that you defend so fiercely, simply dissolves, not gradually, not reluctantly, but completely. Think about this carefully. The you who has opinions, who makes decisions, who remembers yesterday and plans tomorrow, that entire psychological structure willingly steps into oblivion. And you do this every single night without the slightest protest. What does this tell us? It reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of consciousness itself. Your ego, the thing you believe you are, is far more fragile, far more temporary than you've been pretending. It's like a mayor who rules the city during the day, but has absolutely no authority when night falls. And when night comes, something else takes over, something far older, far wiser, and far more mysterious than your conscious mind could ever comprehend. I call this the collective unconscious. But don't let the academic terminology fool you. I'm talking about something so real, so tangible that you visit it every single night. It's not a theory. It's not a metaphor. It's the deepest layer of your psyche, and during sleep you descend directly into its waters. Here's what fascinated me most. When you fall asleep, you don't just lose consciousness, you exchange one form of consciousness for another. The rational, ego-driven awareness that dominates your waking hours gets replaced by something far more primal, far more symbolic, far more honest. And this is where dreams emerge. Now, let's examine what happens in this mysterious territory. I spent decades analyzing tens of thousands of dreams, and what I discovered was staggering. Dreams are not random neural firings. They're not meaningless fragments of daily experience reassembling themselves. Dreams are communications from the deepest parts of yourself, parts that your conscious ego has long forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Every night, you receive messages from your own depths. The collective unconscious speaks to you in the ancient language of symbols, archetypes, and mythological patterns that have existed in human consciousness for millennia. But here's the tragedy. Most of you wake up and immediately dismiss these messages as nonsense. You rush back into your ego's comfortable narrative and ignore the wisdom that was trying to reach you. Think about it. Your conscious mind, the part you identify with, occupies maybe 1/10 of your total psyche. The other 9/10, the vast unconscious realm, operates entirely beyond your awareness during the day. But at night, when the ego finally loosens its grip, this hidden majority gets to speak. And what does it say? It shows you everything you've been refusing to see about yourself. I discovered something rather disturbing in my research. The unconscious doesn't care about your carefully constructed self-image. It doesn't respect your denials, your rationalizations, your comfortable lies. During sleep, it presents you with the raw, unfiltered truth of who you actually are beneath all the personas you wear during the day. This is what I came to call the shadow. All those aspects of yourself that you've deemed unacceptable, all those impulses you've repressed, all those potentials you've denied, they don't simply vanish. They sink into the unconscious and wait. And at night, in dreams, they emerge. Sometimes as monsters, sometimes as strangers, sometimes as situations that terrify or confuse you. But always, always they're trying to show you the parts of yourself you've refused to integrate. Now here's what should deeply concern you. If you spend your entire life ignoring these nocturnal messages, if you consistently reject what the unconscious is trying to show you, something dangerous begins to happen. The rejected contents don't stay quietly in the depths. They begin to influence your waking life in ways you don't understand. Irrational fears, unexplained anxieties, sudden impulses, destructive patterns, all of these are often the shadow trying to get your attention through the only means left available. But let's go deeper, because there's something even more mysterious happening during sleep. Beyond your personal unconscious, beyond even your shadow, you descend into what I've called the collective unconscious. This is not your personal psychological history. This is the psychological inheritance of the entire human species. Imagine this. Every night you step out of your individual identity and enter a realm where the boundaries between you and the rest of humanity dissolve. You access the same archetypal patterns, the same primordial images, the same fundamental structures of meaning that have existed in human consciousness since our species first became aware of itself. This is why certain symbols appear universally in dreams across all cultures and all time periods. The wise old man, the great mother, the hero's journey, the descent into darkness, the rebirth into light. These aren't learned. They're inherited. They're hardwired into the deepest structures of the human psyche. And every night in sleep, you reunite with this ancestral wisdom. What does this mean? It means that when you sleep, you're not just an isolated individual losing consciousness. You're participating in something far more vast. You're connecting with the accumulated experience of countless generations, accessing patterns of meaning that existed long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. I spent years exploring this territory through my own dreams, through active imagination, through careful analysis of my patients' nocturnal experiences, and I discovered something that changed everything I understood about consciousness. The ego is not primary. Consciousness, as you know it during waking hours, is actually secondary, derivative, a late development in the evolution of the psyche. What's primary is this vast unconscious realm, this ocean of potential from which your ego consciousness emerged like a small island. And every night in sleep, you return to those oceanic depths. The island temporarily submerges back into the sea. You become unindividuated again. You dissolve back into the collective whole from which you arose. Now, this should make you profoundly uncomfortable, because it suggests that what you think of as your essential self, your core identity, your conscious awareness, is actually just a temporary formation. It's real, certainly. It's important, absolutely. But it's not fundamental. It's not permanent. It's a wave that rises from the ocean at birth and returns to the ocean each night until finally, at death, it returns permanently. Here's what disturbed me most in my research. Most people are terrified of this truth. They cling desperately to ego consciousness, treating it as though it were the only valid form of awareness. They fill their lives with constant stimulation, constant activity, constant thinking, anything to avoid descending into the depths where the ego loses its authority. But this resistance to the unconscious, this fear of what lies beneath, this creates the very neuroses that plague modern humanity. We've become a civilization of individuals cut off from our own depths, terrified of darkness, obsessed with control, desperately trying to keep the light of consciousness burning at all times. And we're suffering for it. I observed this pattern repeatedly in my patients. The ones who couldn't sleep, who feared their dreams, who rushed through their mornings trying to forget what they'd experienced in the night, these were always the ones with the most severe psychological conflicts. They were at war with their own depths, and that war was destroying them. What I learned to teach them, what I'm trying to tell you now, is that sleep is not an enemy to be minimized or a waste to be endured. Sleep is a sacred descent, a necessary return, a nightly death and rebirth that keeps you psychologically whole. The ego must die every night so that something larger than ego can be contacted, can be integrated, can inform your waking life with wisdom your conscious mind cannot access. Let me share something I discovered through active imagination. There are layers to this nightly descent. First, you pass through the personal unconscious, encountering your own repressed contents, your own unlived life, your own shadow. This is where most dreams occur, where personal symbols dominate, where your individual psychological history plays itself out in symbolic form. But if you go deeper, if you sink further, you enter territories where personal identity becomes increasingly irrelevant. Here you encounter the archetypes themselves. not as personal symbols, but as autonomous powers, as living forces that have their own reality, their own intelligence, their own purposes that have nothing to do with your individual ego. I met these figures many times. The wise old man who appeared in my dreams, offering guidance I didn't consciously possess. The anima, the feminine aspect of my psyche, leading me into territories my rational mind would never have explored. The shadow in its many forms, forcing me to confront what I'd been denying about myself. These weren't products of my imagination. They were encounters with real psychological forces that exist in the collective unconscious. And here's what you must understand. These archetypal powers don't sleep just because you wake up. They continue to influence you throughout your waking life, but now unconsciously, now without your awareness. Every time you fall in love, you're being moved by the anima or animus archetype. Every time you seek wisdom, you're responding to the wise old man. Every time you embark on a challenging journey, you're enacting the hero's myth. The archetypes are always active, always shaping your experience, whether you're conscious of them or not. This is why I became so insistent on the importance of dream work, of active imagination, of paying attention to what happens during sleep. Because if you remain unconscious of these forces, if you never make contact with the archetypes, if you never integrate the shadow, then you remain a puppet dancing on strings you cannot see. You think you're making conscious choices, but you're actually being moved by unconscious powers you've never acknowledged. Now let's address something even more unsettling. During deep sleep, during those hours when even dreams don't visit, where does consciousness go? I wrestled with this question for years. Because in deep sleep, there's no ego, no dreams, no experiences of any kind. And yet clearly you continue to exist. Something persists, but what? What I came to understand is that deep sleep represents a return to the most fundamental level of the psyche, what I might call the self with a capital S. This is not your ego self, not your personal identity, but the totality of the psyche, the whole from which ego consciousness is just one small part. In deep sleep, you experience temporary union with this totality. You become unseparated from the whole. The mystics called this union with the divine. I prefer to call it reunion with the self, but we're describing the same experience, the same state where individual consciousness dissolves into something far more vast, and you achieve this state naturally, effortlessly, every single night. What's tragic is that you achieve it unconsciously. You experience the very thing that mystics spend lifetimes seeking, but you're not awake to it. You reunite with the self, but you're not conscious of the reunion. This is why I developed the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming conscious of what you already are unconsciously. Individuation means learning to stay awake during the descent into sleep. Not physically awake, but psychologically aware. It means developing the ability to witness your own dissolution, to observe the ego releasing its grip, to remain conscious as you sink into the collective unconscious and beyond. This is the great work of a human life. Most people never attempt this work. They live their entire lives identified solely with the ego, terrified of the unconscious, treating sleep as mere rest rather than the profound spiritual practice it actually is. And then they wonder why they feel incomplete, why life seems meaningless, why, despite all their achievements, they still feel fundamentally dissatisfied. I'll tell you why. Because you're living as a fraction of what you actually are. You're identifying with the tiny island of ego consciousness while ignoring the vast ocean of the unconscious that constitutes most of your being. You're like someone living in one room of a mansion, convinced that single room is the entire house, never opening the doors to discover the countless chambers that await exploration. Every night in sleep, those doors open whether you want them to or not. The question is, will you pay attention? Will you remember your dreams? Will you attempt to understand the symbolic language in which the unconscious speaks? Will you have the courage to confront your shadow? Will you develop a relationship with the archetypal powers that move through your psyche? This is not optional spiritual work for the especially interested. This is essential psychological development for anyone who wants to live consciously, anyone who wants to become whole, anyone who wants to stop being unconsciously driven by forces they don't understand. Now, let me tell you something I learned late in my life. The fear of sleep is ultimately the fear of death, because sleep is a kind of death, a nightly rehearsal for the final dissolution. Every evening, you practice letting go of ego consciousness. Every morning, you practice being reborn. And this rhythm, this constant dying and being reborn, this is teaching you the fundamental truth that your conscious ego is not permanent, not essential, not who you actually are in the deepest sense. What you are, what I discovered through decades of exploration, is far more vast than any ego could contain. You are the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, light and shadow, ego and self. And sleep is the nightly reminder of this totality, the recurring invitation to remember what you actually are beneath all the narrow identifications of waking life. So what do you do with this knowledge? How does this change the way you live? Let me be practical. Starting tonight, treat your sleep differently. Before you close your eyes, take a moment to consciously acknowledge what you're about to do. You're not just resting, you're descending into your own depths, you're meeting your shadow, you're communing with the collective unconscious, you're reuniting temporarily with the self. Keep a dream journal by your bed. When you wake, immediately write down whatever fragments you remember. Don't dismiss them. Don't analyze them to death, just record them. Over time, patterns will emerge. The unconscious will begin to trust that you're finally paying attention, and it will communicate more clearly, more directly. Learn the language of symbols. Understand that the unconscious doesn't speak in literal terms. It speaks in images, in metaphors, in mythological patterns. When you dream of water, it's showing you the unconscious itself. When you dream of houses, it's showing you your psyche. When you dream of strangers, it's showing you aspects of yourself you haven't integrated. Learn this language and you'll unlock messages that have been trying to reach you for years. Most importantly, develop active imagination. This is the practice of intentionally descending into the unconscious while remaining conscious. You enter a state between waking and sleeping, allow images to arise, and then interact with them consciously. It's like having a waking dream where you maintain awareness and can dialogue with the figures that appear. Through active imagination, you can meet your shadow consciously rather than being ambushed by it in life. You can encounter the archetypes and learn what they want from you. You can integrate unconscious contents that have been fragmenting your psyche. This is the real work of becoming whole, of achieving what I call individuation. But I must warn you, this work is not easy. It requires tremendous courage to face your shadow, to acknowledge everything you've been denying about yourself. It requires humility to recognize that your ego is not in charge, that vast unconscious forces have been running your life. It requires patience to learn a symbolic language you've been trained to ignore. And it requires commitment to continue this work, even when it becomes uncomfortable, even when it challenges your carefully constructed self-image. Yet this work is essential, because the alternative is to remain unconscious, to be driven by forces you don't understand, to project your shadow onto others, to live as a fraction of your potential, to die never having truly awakened to what you actually are. I have seen both paths. I have worked with patients who courageously faced their depths and emerged transformed, whole, truly alive. And I have seen those who refused the call, who spent their lives running from their own unconscious, who became increasingly neurotic, increasingly fragmented, increasingly disconnected from themselves and others. The choice is yours. Every night, sleep offers you an opportunity to descend consciously, to learn from your depths, to integrate what has been split off, to become whole. The question is whether you'll take advantage of this gift or whether you'll continue treating sleep as merely rest, dreams as merely nonsense, the unconscious as merely irrelevant. What I discovered, what I'm telling you now, is that consciousness doesn't vanish during sleep. It transforms, it expands, it touches territories that waking ego consciousness cannot access. And these territories contain wisdom, healing, wholeness that your conscious mind desperately needs but can never achieve on its own. So tonight, when you lie down to sleep, remember this: you're not losing consciousness. You're exchanging one limited form of awareness for access to something far more vast. You're descending into your own depths where ancient wisdom awaits, where archetypal powers move, where the shadow lurks, but also where the self resides in its totality. And when you wake tomorrow morning, instead of immediately resuming your ego's narrative, pause for just a moment, feel the transition, notice how consciousness reorganizes itself, how the island of ego re-emerges from the oceanic depths, and ask yourself, what did I learn in the night? What is my unconscious trying to tell me? How can I bring some of that depth, that wisdom, that wholeness into my waking life? This is the work, this is the path, this is how you stop sleepwalking through life and finally truly wake up. Not by staying trapped in ego consciousness, but by learning to navigate consciously between ego and unconscious, between waking and sleeping, between the island and the ocean. I have spent my life mapping these territories, and what I can tell you with absolute certainty is this: the unconscious is not your enemy. Sleep is not your enemy. The shadow is not your enemy. They're all parts of you, trying desperately to be recognized, to be integrated, to make you whole. The tragedy is that most of you will ignore this invitation. You'll continue treating sleep as waste, dreams as nonsense, the unconscious as irrelevant. And you'll wonder why life feels incomplete, why you keep repeating the same patterns, why, despite all your conscious efforts, something still feels fundamentally wrong. But you have been given the map. The territories exist. The journey is possible. And every night the door opens. The question is whether you'll finally have the courage to step through it consciously, to meet what awaits you in your own depths, to become what you've always potentially been but never dared to actualize. Where does your consciousness go when you sleep? It goes home. It returns to the source. It reunites with the totality from which it emerged. And if you learn to make this journey consciously, if you learn to bring back wisdom from the depths, if you learn to integrate unconscious and conscious into a greater whole, then you become truly awake. Not just during the day, but throughout the entire cycle of waking and sleeping, consciousness and unconsciousness, life and death. This is individuation. This is wholeness. This is what it means to be fully human. And it begins tonight when you close your eyes and consciously choose to descend into your own mysterious depths.